So moving on to an interesting story where the Pitt Rivers Museum,
Mm.
a wonderful museum that I believe in recent years has been undergoing various revamps and the architecturally, but also in terms of the collection. The Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, Oxford University, has decided to hire Syrian refugees as tour guides, and this is an interesting one because specifically, actually, one cannot be paid for work if one is claiming asylum. If that process is
That's right.
so they haven't got work permits, so they're being hired as volunteers within the Pitt Rivers Museum, and in particular, what they're hoping is to be able to contextualize lots of the Islamic collections, and also to foster personal stories and relatable observations between the tour guides and people who go on tours in those collections in the museum. What do you make of this notion of doing this in this way?
I love this story for all sorts of reasons. First of all, I think we should make clear for our audience who maybe aren't familiar with the Pitt Rivers Museum, it's part of Oxford University. It's run by Oxford University, and it's effectively their anthropological collection.
Yeah.
Um, Pitt Rivers being a pioneer Victorian archaeologist and ethnographer.
Well,
And
indeed, Pitt Rivers and Mortimer Wheeler are just two names that they're
they're in
equally yes.
absolutely they're up there. They're stellar names in the development of British archaeology.
Hmm.
And Pitt Rivers particularly famous for the excavations on Cranbourne Chase,
Mm-hmm.
where he pioneered a lot of modern ideas about recording and excavating. He's seen as one of the first modern archaeologists in many respects.
Mm-hmm.
And he's very important in the family tree of the development of archaeological techniques and so on. So Oxford University has this wonderful ethnographic collection that's endowed and named for Pitt Rivers. Um, there's always the question nowadays in museums of making giving the objects context. You don't just have serried Victorian, ranks of Victorian glass cases with objects with type labels. Now, and in fact, some museums like to still reference that as a jumping off point. The Horniman Museum in London is one, which is another Victorian endowment. The Pitt Rivers Museum itself actually keeps a lot of the flavour of its original exhibitions.
Mm-hmm.
But what they're trying to do is move beyond that now, and the objects themselves, to give them this context, and to, I'm sure we would all, and the refugees themselves particularly, would rather be able to live in their homes safely and securely in Syria or wherever else in the Middle East they come from. But we all know the horrors that have been going on there for the last 5 years or so now.
Mm.
And the way the movement of people who are refugees to outside countries, most of them actually locally to places like Jordan and so on, but many also to Western Europe, and the controversies that's raised.
Mm.
I think a positive story like this is so important in that context, because it's saying, not only that these are people who deserve to be given a chance of, if not gainful employment, because they can't do that under the law, as you said, they're not allowed to take out a work permit if they're claiming political asylum as a refugee.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But to give them something worthwhile to do that reinforces their humanity, actually, in the eyes of the host country, which can seem, parts of the media certainly, can seem unwelcoming at times.
Well, the the project it's actually it's external to the university. It's a project called Multaka Oxford. Multaka being the Arabic word for meeting point.
Indeed.
And Rachel Harrison, volunteer and engagement coordinator at Multaka Oxford, said that each guide will give a personalised tour based on objects they choose from the Islamic astronomical instruments at the Museum of History and Science and the Middle Eastern textiles at the Pitt Rivers Museum. She said, "We hope this will also hope to improve the public's knowledge of the Islamic world's contributions to science and culture, which are overlooked in British education. First public tours, given in Arabic with an English translator, will be on the Friday the 16th of November. So they happened a little earlier, in the middle of the month, or they started in the middle of the month. But crucially, what's interesting is this idea of a meeting point is really quite nicely echoed in the fact that the museum itself says, here at the museum we share a human history and culture. Today, I heard, this is a quote, I heard one woman say she is from Hungary and how she sees that we are similar with clothes and traditions. The museum really is a meeting point for culture. And I really like this reframing of the museum, as you say, moving away from a curio cabinet and moving away from that sort of slightly weird imperialistic sort of what's the word, Orientalism almost, the mysterious East especially. And this could actually be a little key to the future of museums and the reason for having museums with robust international collections, curated in the right way and where possible repatriated, but nonetheless having access to material that helps to be a meeting point.
Can
for
I just
cultures.
pick you up on something there, Mike? You said where possible repatriated. Repatriate the stuff, if you repatriate the stuff, you can't have a project like this.
No, where I see, what I mean by that is if you have a controversial object. I'm not saying this is an argument to keep, for example, the original Parthenon marbles necessarily. These days you can 3D print those. We can have the copies, and Greece can have the originals at some point, hopefully. But this idea of having a collection that hopefully is a meeting point for cultures is, I think, a good first step in reframing the story of these, especially these older British museums and these institutions that sometimes get a bad rep as being greedy or culturally imperialistic in some way.
I think you've nailed a particular issue there, in that yes, a lot of these museums were endowed and filled at a time when attitudes to collecting cultural objects were very different to the ones that are prevalent in the museum world, and certainly the developed museums in the developed world today, in 2018. I mean, I think there's one quote in the Guardian coverage of this story that leapt out at me, and in fact, I think they saw it as an important way of encapsulating the story, because they lead on it, and it's quoting a woman called Mariam Kara Ahmed, who is part of the project and is a Syrian refugee, and they quote her as saying, and she, obviously, as we heard, the Syrian participants in the project are looking at the textiles in particular, Middle Eastern textiles. And Mariam is quoted as saying, "When I was in Syria, if I saw a handmade dress like this, I just thought it was normal. Now I come here and I see it is very special." So there's all sorts of layers of interest and meaning in that, in terms of how we relate to cultural objects. Yeah. That's something that we see as everyday, in another cultural context, can be seen as something exceptional.
Or, I suppose, in the context of your life being torn up, in that sense, or your country being torn up.
Well, this is right. And also, she was talking from a professional point of view, because she used to work in the textile factory. So responding to presumably local people's needs and desires, in fashion sense and cultural requirements and so on. So there's all sorts of very interesting. As I said when we started talking about this in some, I just think it's a terrific project, and the kind of thing museums should be doing. There's a lot of talk in projects and project designs about added value, and this is real added value and hopefully added value for everybody taking part, because it should hopefully help reaffirm people's own identity and confidence and self-respect, as well as offering a unique perspective for people who wouldn't otherwise have that cultural perspective. Great stuff.
A bit of pride as well. Yeah, absolutely. Okay.